May 3rd. 1945. The island of Okinawa was a furnace of fire and steel. In the battered village of Shuri, a woman named Sachiko Miyagi clutched her 4-year-old daughter Yuki in the darkness of their ruined home. The air was thick with dust, the smell of smoke, and the muffled thunder of battle that never seemed to end. Hours earlier, the American artillery had pounded the area until wooden beams and stone walls gave way. Now, the debris pinned Sachiko's legs, and every creak of the shattered roof felt like a warning that it might come crashing down. She held Yuki tight, her hand pressed over the child's mouth, praying that no sound would escape, because in Sachiko's mind, silence meant survival. For years, the Japanese military police and neighborhood officials had drilled it into them. If the Americans found you, death would follow. Not just death, but rape, torture, humiliation, and mutilation at the hands of foreign demons who, they were told, knew no honor or mercy. Better to kill your own children. Better to die as a family than to let the enemy lay hands upon you. So when Sachiko heard voices calling in English just outside the ruins, her heart froze. This was the moment she had dreaded. She had no grenades, no poison, the supplies the Imperial Army had distributed to many families for suicide. All she could do was wait for the end. And then she heard something impossible. A voice, halting, rough with a foreign accent, but unmistakably Japanese. Dareka imasuka, tasukemasu. Is anyone there? We'll help you. At first, she thought it was a cruel trick, another deception to lure civilians out. Yet the words came again, closer this time, until the rubble shifted and daylight broke through the gap. A young American soldier crawled in. His name was Private Danny Kowalski, a 20-year-old from Detroit. He was dirty, exhausted, and very much an enemy in every sense of what Sachiko had been taught. And yet, instead of raising a weapon, he bent down, braced his shoulders, and lifted the heavy beam trapping her. He then scooped little Yuki into his arms and crawled back through the wreckage to safety, only to return moments later for the mother. As Japanese machine gun fire cracked overhead, Kowalski shielded them with his body, guiding them toward an American aid station for civilians. Sachiko had braced herself for death. Instead, she and her daughter were alive, protected, not destroyed, by the hands of the demons. That single moment carried with it an irony so sharp it could cut through years of indoctrination. For Sachiko and countless Okinawans, the most shocking revelation of defeat was not American brutality, but American mercy. What they had been told was a horde of monsters proved, in that instant, capable of compassion that went against everything they had been led to believe. This story was not unique. Time and again during the brutal Battle of Okinawa, similar encounters shattered the illusions carefully woven by Japanese propaganda. Families who had expected slaughter discovered soldiers offering food. Children who thought strangers were demons were given chocolate, toys, and medical care. Soldiers who had crossed the Pacific expecting only fanatical resistance suddenly found themselves rescuing women and children from the rubble of war. This was not the story of battles won by artillery or tanks. It was the story of something more surprising. How? In the darkest chapter of the Pacific War, moments of humanity broke through the firestorm. But how did such a reversal become possible? To understand, we must step back, because before Americans arrived, the Okinawan people had already endured a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make compassion impossible, surrender unthinkable, and fear stronger than reason. And it is in that darkness that the story of Sachiko and her daughter takes on its deepest meaning. To truly grasp the weight of Sachiko Miyagi's fear, we have to understand the world she lived in before that beam collapsed upon her. Okinawa in 1945 was not merely a battlefield, it was a society shaped by years of indoctrination. Caught between the iron grip of Japanese military command and the looming shadow of the approaching Americans. For months leading up to the invasion, Okinawan civilians had been bombarded not only with artillery but with relentless propaganda. Every available channel of communication radio broadcasts, school lessons, community meetings hammered home a single message. The Americans were demons. Not just enemies in a military sense, but something subhuman, without compassion, without mercy, creatures that delighted in cruelty. Children were taught songs celebrating death over capture. In classrooms, teachers painted horrific pictures of what happened to those who surrendered. Mutilation, torture, violation. For young minds, the lesson was clear. Suicide was honorable. Survival in enemy hands was not. Families were given grenades, cyanide, and in some cases even bamboo spears. Not for fighting, but for ensuring that no one in the household would fall alive into American hands. Women were quietly told how to kill their children before turning the weapon on themselves. This was not a localized effort. It was systematic, directed by the Japanese High Command with the specific purpose of prolonging resistance. Because Okinawa was not like the other islands already taken by American forces. Places like Tarawa, Saipan, or Iwo Jima had been garrisons military outposts where civilians were few. If they existed at all, Okinawa was different. This was home to some 300 civilians, living side by side with entrenched Japanese troops. If those civilians surrendered en masse, the defensive lines could collapse. Fear was the weapon that could keep them in place, bind them to the fate of the army, and deny the Americans an easy occupation. The cultural weight of Bushido made this message even more powerful. The code of the warrior had long since been twisted into state ideology. Death before dishonor. Loyalty unto annihilation. For Okinawan villagers, many of whom had never even seen an American, the tales of cruelty were not mere rumors, they were reinforced by cultural duty. To die as a family, even in fire or by one's own hand, it was portrayed as a final service to the emperor. And the emperor's presence loomed large. Even here on this island at the far southern edge of Japan's home territory, neighborhood officials reminded civilians that any sign of surrender raising a white flag, approaching enemy lines, even speaking of survival would be punished as treason. The dreaded Kempeitai, the military police, he enforced this with ruthless efficiency. Families who wavered risked execution at the hands of their own countrymen before they ever reached the Americans. The result was a population trapped in a mental cage as solid as any bunker. When American leaflets fluttered down from the skies promising humane treatment, most Okinawans dismissed them as lies. How could they be true when every trusted voice told them otherwise? When every authority figure insisted that the enemy had no humanity at all? It is important to note that this was not uniquely Japanese. History is full of desperate regimes weaponizing fear to hold populations in line. In the final days of Nazi Germany, for example, civilians were told that surrender to the advancing Soviets would mean mass rape, slavery, and annihilation. In many cases, those fears proved tragically justified. The Japanese military borrowed from this same playbook, amplifying enemy monstrosity until people saw suicide as salvation. Yet Okinawa was unique because of the sheer scale of the civilian presence within a battlefield. The island was to be the last great fortress before the mainland, and Tokyo's high command ordered its defenders to make every inch bleed. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dug into the ridges and caves of the island. They did not merely fight from bunkers, they fought from homes, from schools, from shrines, turning villages into fortresses. Civilians were trapped between these defenses and the oncoming American onslaught. And so, when the bombardment began in April 1945, families like Sachiko's were already psychologically primed to believe the worst. Each explosion was not just another shell, it was another reason to expect that survival was impossible. By the time American boots entered the villages, the damage was already done. People looked at soldiers not as men but as monsters. They were prepared to die because they had been told repeatedly, methodically, that death was preferable. This was the world Private Kowalski stepped into when he crawled into that rubble, a world where trust had been poisoned at its root, where kindness was inconceivable. And it is precisely against this backdrop of fear and indoctrination that the shock of American compassion struck with such force. When American forces stormed the beaches of Okinawa in April 1945, most soldiers thought they knew what to expect. They had fought their way across the Pacific island by island, facing the ferocity of Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender. At Tarawa, at Saipan, and at Iwo Jima, they had met an enemy who fought to the death, often preferring suicide to capture. But on Okinawa, something new entered the battlefield. Civilians, hundreds of thousands of them. As the U.S. Army and Marines pushed inland, they found not just caves filled with soldiers, but shattered homes filled with families. Women clutching infants, elderly men hunched in corners, children peering out from basements with wide, terrified eyes. These were not combatants, yet they had been told that the Americans would treat them worse than any enemy soldier. The first encounters were often heartbreaking. Soldiers reported finding groups of civilians who had attempted suicide rather than risk capture. Some had thrown themselves off cliffs, convinced that Americans would subject them to horrors if they lived. Others had huddled silently in rubble, refusing to move even as buildings burned around them. For the American soldiers, hardened by years of brutal combat, this was a shock. They were trained to destroy enemy fortifications, not to coax frightened children from hiding places. Corporal Bobby Martinez, a Texan who had fought across the Pacific, wrote home to his wife about what he saw. "We found them everywhere. Old folks, women, little kids hiding in basements and bombed-out houses. They were so scared they couldn't even cry when they saw us coming. Some of them tried to kill themselves rather than be captured. We had to move real slow and gentle to convince them we weren't going to hurt them." This was a radical shift in the rhythm of war. One moment, soldiers were under fire from machine guns hidden in a nearby ridge. The next, they were lowering their weapons and whispering reassurances to families who recoiled at their approach. The battlefield blurred into something unfamiliar, a place where combat and compassion collided within the same breath. The civilians' responses followed patterns that repeated across the island. At first came terror. Many believed it was better to run into gunfire or swallow poison than let the enemy touch them. Then came hesitation, as soldiers offered water, food, or simple gestures of peace. Finally, sometimes after hours or even days, came the slow dawning realization that these strangers meant no harm. This process was not easy. Communication was a formidable barrier. Few Americans spoke Japanese, and fewer still spoke the Okinawan dialect. Yet actions often spoke louder than words. Soldiers would kneel, offer rations, or bandage wounds. These simple gestures, repeated over and over, began to crack the armor of fear that propaganda had built around the civilians. The contrast with earlier campaigns was profound. On Iwo Jima, there had been almost no civilians, just soldiers locked in a death struggle. But on Okinawa, the presence of families forced a different kind of war. Suddenly, American soldiers had to balance two duties: destroying an entrenched enemy and protecting innocents trapped among them. It was a responsibility no field manual had prepared them for. The dilemma cut deep. Every village could contain Japanese soldiers hiding in civilian clothes, waiting to ambush. Every home could be a trap. Yet within those same ruins were children starving for food, women desperate for medicine, and elderly villagers who had nowhere to go. The line between enemy and non-combatant blurred, demanding instant decisions in life or death moments. The result was a strange duality. Soldiers might storm a fortified cave one day, taking casualties in brutal close-quarters combat, and the next, find themselves cradling a frightened child or leading a grandmother to safety. The juxtaposition was jarring, but it also humanized the battlefield in ways that few had expected. For the civilians, these encounters were equally transformative. Every gesture of kindness chipped away at the image of the American demon. Every sip of clean water, every bandaged wound, every shared ration opened cracks in the wall of fear. Slowly, cautiously, many began to realize that the enemy was not what they had been told. The main events of April and May, 1945, were filled with such encounters, small, fragile moments of humanity set against a backdrop of relentless violence. They were not battles in the traditional sense, but they were just as decisive in shaping the outcome of Okinawa. Because in those fleeting, perilous rescues, the first seeds of trust were planted. And from that trust, a new relationship between conqueror and conquered began to grow. One that would outlast the smoke and fire of war. The rescues on Okinawa were never simple acts of kindness performed in safety. They unfolded in the midst of a battlefield that was one of the most lethal in the entire Pacific War. By May 1945, American soldiers were advancing through a storm of sniper fire, mortars, and machine gun bursts. The Japanese defenders, dug deep into caves and ridges, fought with ferocity, and civilians were often trapped directly in the line of fire. To help them meant taking extraordinary risks. Private Danny Kowalski's rescue of Sachiko and her daughter was just one of many such acts. In another case, Corporal Tony Rizzo and two fellow Marines crawled across open ground under sniper fire to pull 3 children from a collapsed home. They knew the rubble might be booby-trapped. Japanese defenders had wired houses with explosives before. Yet they went anyway, guided only by the faint sound of crying beneath the dust. For their trouble, they carried back not prisoners, but sobbing children who clung to them as though to lifelines. These moments often blurred the battle lines themselves. In some cases, Japanese snipers actually held their fire while Americans evacuated civilians from danger zones. It was a strange, unspoken pause in the war, enemy soldiers watching silently as children were carried out of ruins. Whether this was mercy, hesitation, or a tactical calculation is impossible to know. But in those rare seconds, the battlefield seemed to acknowledge a truth deeper than victory or defeat, that the lives of innocents carried a weight beyond strategy. The danger extended beyond bullets. The very terrain of Okinawa was deadly. Buildings half destroyed by artillery could collapse at any moment. Caves where civilians huddled were often filled with smoke, poisonous gas, or flooding water. Soldiers who went in to help risked suffocation or entrapment. Medics and engineers often led these efforts, crawling into unstable spaces where even a whispered movement might trigger a cave-in. The paradox of these rescues was stark. The same soldiers who had been trained and hardened to kill were now acting as shields, crawling through rubble with their helmets off, offering their canteens to civilians, risking their lives for strangers who, only hours earlier, had believed them to be monsters. War had forced them into roles they never imagined, protectors as much as destroyers. For civilians, these acts were almost incomprehensible. Many expected betrayal the moment they stepped into American hands. Yet what they found was the opposite. Soldiers carried them to aid stations, where medics patched wounds, offered food, and in some cases, even gave up their own rations. For mothers who had been prepared to kill their children to save them from capture, it was like awakening in another world. Eyewitness accounts capture the tension of these rescues. One Marine described approaching a cave where dozens of civilians were hiding. They had been told Americans would torture them. Instead of storming the cave with grenades, the Marines waited. They shouted assurances, left food at the entrance, and stepped back. Hours later, a trickle of children emerged, followed by women carrying infants. The Marines laid down their weapons on the ground, deliberately, so that the civilians could see their hands were empty. It was not a maneuver taught in training manuals. It was an act born from instinct, empathy, and necessity. The rescues came at terrible cost. Some soldiers died attempting to save civilians. One army medic was shot through the chest as he tried to carry a wounded girl back to the lines. His comrades later said he never hesitated, even though he must have known he was a target. His sacrifice underscored the brutal reality. Saving lives on Okinawa was every bit as dangerous as taking them. Yet these climactic moments, the crawling into ruins, the shielding of children under fire, the deliberate laying down of weapons became the turning points in the battle's human dimension. They transformed the war from a clash of armies into something more complex. A collision of fear and compassion, propaganda and reality. It was here, in the rubble and smoke, that Okinawan civilians first saw a vision of the enemy that defied everything they had been told. And it was here that American soldiers discovered an unexpected role, one that challenged their own understanding of what it meant to fight. By late May 1945, something remarkable was happening across Okinawa. The iron grip of fear that had bound civilians to Japanese propaganda was beginning to crack. It did not shatter all at once. Trust was fragile, built slowly and unevenly, but it grew with every encounter between civilians and American soldiers who chose compassion over cruelty. The first to respond were often the children. Their fear, though real, was less anchored by years of indoctrination than that of their parents or grandparents. When American soldiers extended chocolate bars or sticks of chewing gum, the hesitation was often brief. A child's instinct to reach for sweetness overcame the warnings whispered by frightened mothers. And when the children survived the encounter, unharmed indeed, smiling, sticky-fingered, and alive, their families could no longer reconcile the reality with the nightmare they had been told. American medical care became another turning point. For civilians who had lived without antibiotics, the sight of wounds being stitched, fevers treated, or infections cured seemed almost miraculous. Parents watched children pulled back from the brink of death in field hospitals staffed by medics who should best, according to propaganda, have been torturers. Instead, they were saviors in white bandages and stained fatigues. Language barriers remained daunting, but they were not insurmountable. Japanese-American interpreters, especially Nisei soldiers like Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, played a critical role. When civilians heard fluent Japanese spoken by men in American uniforms, the propaganda narratives unraveled even faster. How could Americans despise them if they trusted Japanese-speaking soldiers to serve among their ranks? Yamamoto later recalled that simply telling mothers, in their own language, that their children would be safe often brought them to tears. Gestures of cultural respect also mattered. Some American soldiers learned to bow slightly, to remove their shoes when entering damaged homes, or to accept rice offerings with gratitude. These were small acts, but in a society where respect carried deep meaning, they showed that the Americans were not the crude beasts civilians had been warned about. Each bow, each quiet arigato, struck directly against the caricature of the barbarian invader. Meanwhile, military engineers began repairing wells, clearing roads, and restoring electricity in certain villages. Civilians saw that the Americans were not only tearing down with artillery, but also building up with tools. A new narrative began to spread not from propaganda leaflets, but from whispered testimonies. They are not what we were told. They help us. They feed our children. They treat the sick. The cumulative effect was profound. Fear did not vanish, but it transformed. Where once civilians feared annihilation at American hands, they began to fear the Japanese soldiers who tried to keep them from surrendering. Accounts describe Okinawans slipping away at night to reach American lines, risking execution by their own countrymen in order to seek safety. In the final weeks of the battle, thousands made that desperate choice. Proof that trust had tipped the balance. This transformation also carried long-term consequences. When the battle ended in June 1945, Okinawa was devastated, its villages in ruins, its people shattered. Yet the seeds of cooperation had already been planted. Civilians who had been rescued, treated, or sheltered by Americans became the first voices to argue that occupation might not mean annihilation. Their stories spread through refugee camps and destroyed towns, softening resistance to the U.S. military presence that would endure long after the war. For the Americans, the consequences were equally significant. Soldiers who had spent years fighting an enemy that rarely surrendered suddenly found themselves as protectors. Many later said these moments reshaped their understanding of the war. The battle was no longer only about defeating an enemy, it was about proving that mercy could coexist with force. Some veterans carried those memories more strongly than the firefights themselves. On a broader level, the collapse of fear in Okinawa revealed something powerful. Propaganda, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be undone by consistent, tangible acts of compassion. What years of indoctrination had built, a single act of rescue could begin to dismantle. In the rubble of Okinawa, the Americans had stumbled upon an unexpected truth that trust, once seeded, could survive even amid the most brutal war in history. The humanitarian encounters on Okinawa were not simply emotional footnotes in a brutal campaign. They carried strategic and historical weight, influencing how the war ended and shaping the post-war world that followed. From a military perspective, compassion itself became a weapon. The Japanese High Command had invested enormous energy in terrifying Okinawans into obedience. If civilians resisted capture, sheltered soldiers, or even killed themselves, the Imperial Army could delay the American advance. But when Americans consistently treated civilians humanely, that propaganda collapsed. Once word spread that the demons offered food, medicine, and protection, the grip of fear loosened. Families began to surrender, sometimes in groups of dozens, even hundreds. Civilians guided Americans to caves, pointed out minefields, and revealed Japanese troop movements. What had once been a liability, thousands of terrified non-combatants turned into an intelligence advantage. The impact was psychological as well as tactical. For civilians, survival was no longer synonymous with dishonor. For soldiers, their role expanded beyond destroying an enemy. They became builders, healers, even symbols of a different kind of future. These dual roles blurred the brutal simplicity of war. And yet, paradoxically, they also made American victory more complete. Because it was not only a battlefield triumph, it was a moral one. On the global stage, Okinawa became an unspoken demonstration of American soft power at the very moment when the world was deciding what the post-war order would look like. In Europe, civilians had already experienced the difference between Soviet and American liberation. The Soviets often ruled with vengeance and brutality, leaving populations scarred and resentful. In contrast, America's image, bolstered by stories from Okinawa, was that of a conqueror who could destroy but also rebuild, punish but also protect. That contrast would shape alliances for decades to come. The irony was profound. The same military that unleashed unprecedented destruction, obliterating villages with artillery and firebombs, also handed out candy to children and rebuilt schools. The paradox of the destroyer as protector baffled civilians at first, but ultimately proved more powerful than fear. Because if an enemy so capable of violence chose restraint, chose compassion, then perhaps surrender was not the end of dignity but the beginning of survival. This lesson extended beyond Okinawa. The U.S. occupation of Japan itself was made smoother by the precedents set on the island. When the emperor announced surrender in August 1945, millions of Japanese citizens braced for annihilation, expecting the same horrors that Okinawans had once feared. Instead, they saw echoes of Okinawa, order, discipline, and though imperfect efforts at protection and reconstruction. The seeds planted in Okinawa grew into the roots of an alliance that, within a generation, would transform former enemies into partners. For American soldiers, the experience also carried long-lasting consequences. Many veterans later confessed that the rescues and humanitarian moments haunted them more deeply than combat. They remembered the faces of children they had carried out of caves, the trembling hands of mothers who realized their families would live. These memories offered a counterweight to the nightmares of war, proof that even amid destruction, they had been capable of something greater than killing. For historians, Okinawa stands as a study in the duality of power. It shows that military might alone cannot secure lasting outcomes. The ability to terrify can win a battle, but the ability to show mercy can win a people. In that sense, Okinawa foreshadowed a new age of warfare, one in which hearts and minds would become as critical as bullets and bombs. And perhaps the most enduring significance lies in the paradox itself, that amid the most savage battle of the Pacific, where tens of thousands perished, the defining legacy was not only destruction, but the fragile, persistent flame of humanity. As the guns finally fell silent over Okinawa in June 1945, the island was a graveyard. Hills once green were cratered moonscapes. Villages had been reduced to ash and rubble. Nearly a third of the civilian population was dead. Yet within this devastation, a story endured, one that refused to be buried beneath the ruins. That story was not only about destruction, but about an unexpected discovery, that even in the darkest crucible of war, human beings could choose compassion. For Sachiko Miyagi, trapped with her daughter in a collapsed house, salvation had come not from neighbors or soldiers of her own nation, but from a young American private who shielded her with his body as bullets cracked overhead. For children who tasted chocolate for the first time, kindness wore the face of a foreign uniform. For medics and engineers who labored not only to save their comrades, but to heal enemy civilians, war itself was redefined. The Okinawans had been told surrender was worse than death, that Americans were demons with no mercy. But what they found instead was a contradiction so powerful it shattered years of propaganda. Yes, these men could unleash fire and steel without hesitation, but they could also risk their lives to save a crying child. And in that contradiction lay hope, that perhaps humanity could survive even the savagery of modern war. For the Americans, too, the island left an imprint. They had seen fanatical resistance, but also terrified families huddled in caves, their only crime being caught between empires. They had learned that war was not only fought with rifles and mortars, but also with food rations, open hands, and quiet reassurances whispered in broken Japanese. And many carried home a haunting realization that the enemy had faces, names, and families no different from their own. In the decades after, survivors told and retold these stories. Children who once cowered in fear grew old recalling the soldier who offered them candy, or the medic who treated their wounds with gentleness. they had never expected. Veterans, too, remembered not just the violence, but the moments when they had been able to choose mercy. The Battle of Okinawa would be remembered as the bloodiest of the Pacific War, a prelude to the atomic age, and a warning of the terrible cost an invasion of Japan's home islands would have carried. Yet within its brutality lies another legacy, one not written in casualty figures or maps, but in memories of compassion. In the rubble of war, humanity had not been extinguished. It had endured in the hands that lifted children from caves, in the food shared with starving families, in the decision to protect rather than destroy. And from those acts of mercy grew the fragile beginnings of reconciliation, the unlikely path from enemies to allies. Perhaps that is Okinawa's greatest lesson, that even in humanity's darkest hour, when propaganda taught hate and fear, and when survival itself seemed impossible, people could still recognize each other as human, and in doing so, they planted the first seeds of peace.